Hello again, book lovers. You Just Don't Understand. Women and Men in Conversation by Deborah Tannen. Like most books, this was an international bestseller and was published by Virago Press in 1992, though originally this is American. I picked up this book because it was mentioned in another book that I was reading. I can't remember which one now, but it was to do with psychology. It's about the difference between women's and men's psychologies, and is a psychologist's analysis of interactions between men and women, largely on tape or on video. And it was a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be. The first takeaway point, of course, is the notion that girls and boys are different. This was possibly not a contentious statement in 1990, and it might not be in many areas today. It's a necessary starting point for this analysis, as the truth of the statement is simply borne out by the interactions. And we're looking at conversations between boys, between girls, in mixed groups at all stages of development, from about 5-year-old to middle age. And indeed, it is interesting to analyse. Women in boardrooms wouldn't speak up because they were frightened of male-dominant culture. They would proffer an idea which would be ignored and then would later be taken up by a man, and he would be praised for it as his idea. I have to say, the number of women that I know that are in higher positions in organisations would have probably ripped that guy's balls off, so I'm not quite sure who these timid women that got to the top were. The relief of this book is there's precious little theorising, precious little psychobabble, precious little terminology. The one which Ms. Tannen does introduce is report and rapport. Report speaking, favoured by males, we just tell stuff that happened, what went on. And rapport speaking is where you're seeking to establish a relationship on equal terms, normally, with the other person you're speaking to. And these are the things that get confused when men and women speak to each other. What happens if a man is telling a story and he is interrupted, as opposed to a woman telling a story who is interrupted, or in this case at the end of a lecture, for example, when questions from the floor are asked for? Men's questions, whether to men or women, tend to be challenging, whereas the women's questions tend to start off from a point of cooperation with the speaker before analysing any potential differences. And as always, we get some tape scripts to back this point up, which was a great relief after reading Derrida and lots of theory-heavy texts. Why not just give us some examples? I mean, Freud did, didn't he, in his case books? And I often find with academic texts that examples are exactly what's lacking. Rather than give me an explanation of what game theory is, or a non-zero sum game, etc., just give me some examples and I'll understand it a lot better. If we can take the bombshell that men and women do think differently, our author also asks us to accept the fact that gender and culture, in her words, dovetail in such ways that make it difficult for men and women to understand each other. So that would mean it's not just culture, it's genetics as well. Another mammoth revelation. Pardon my sarcasm, but I mean, it is actually being questioned currently. Now, one small criticism is that when the author is talking about tag questions, isn't it, don't they, wouldn't you, there is no distinction made between rising and falling intonation, which I, as a finickety English teacher, think should have been pointed out. Because there's a big difference between it's raining, isn't it, and it's raining, isn't it, for example. However, the analysis of how men and women use tag questions is very interesting. Also, how much silence is tolerated between replies. What "I'm sorry" actually means. That could be an apology, or it could be an expression of sympathy, which leads us on to messages and meta-messages. This is beginning to sound a little bit like technical jargon now, but that's not a tough one to get hold of, is it? I always think of it in terms of talking to a dog. I'm sure everyone that's had a dog has played the game of complimenting the dog in harsh voice, or telling the dog off in a soft voice to see how the dog responds to the tone of voice rather than to the, in quotes, message. There's also an interesting analysis of language used to describe women, the sort of stuff I don't normally get on with, but here's good points being made. Women are described as feisty, and as Ms. Tannen says, you would describe a Pekingese as feisty, but not a Great Dane. It's a kind of backhanded compliment. And another thing that I picked up was this idea of face-to-face conversation. In fact, the cover shows a man and a woman indulging in face-to-face conversation. But the point is made that very often a young boy will open up to the parent while sitting in the car, while not looking at the parent. And this made me think there's a lot in this, isn't there? When we do these psychological experiments, very often we take people out of ordinary environments and put them into quite false ones. So to get a man and a woman sat on a couple of chairs facing each other, it's actually quite natural for the woman, but quite unnatural for the man. Boys will fidget in their chairs. Girls in classes are praised for sitting still. Does that make education systems biased towards girls in that respect? Boys sitting together will sit parallel to each other. They'll make jokes. They'll try to downplay the situation. When they know they're being filmed, they say, "Smile, you're on candid camera." They lounge on the chairs, almost like they're pushing the idea of acceptable posture to a limit, always challenging. This aspect of the unnatural environment made me think of the experiments that were done on cannabis takers in the 60s and 70s in America, where they would pump a bloke full of cannabis while he was in a hospital bed, and then shine bright lights on him and get him to fill the complex questionnaire. It's simply not what people do when they get stoned. And sitting facing each other is not what boys do. Apparently, males don't like eye contact. And there's a nice little bit of critique of the methodology at one point, where the author tells us that raising topics is seen as a dominant point in conversation. So the more topics you raise, the more dominant you are, as it were. But what if the topic is the other person and you're focusing on the other person and asking questions about the other person? Even though you're raising the topic, you're not dominating in that sense. In fact, one of the takeaways of the book is it all depends. I mean, there's all these theories for all these situations and all this crosstalk and silences and eye contact, but a lot of it does depend on a person's personality or a person's recent history or the situation. However, there is a striking example of what Ms. Tannen calls asymmetry in relationships. Think about a couple walking down the street, a heterosexual male-female couple. The man puts the hand on the shoulder, the woman puts the hand round the waist. Sometimes you'll see one of the partners in a normal posture where the other partner links their arm through that person's arms, and you know which way round this is going to be. Apparently, even if the woman is taller than the man will still use the same kind of protective asymmetrical gestures, unless it's a mother and a small child. But that kind of says something as well, doesn't it? Near the end of the book, on page 294, is a paragraph which makes a nice summary of the preceding texts, I suggest. And here it is. Both women and men could benefit from learning each other's styles. Many women could learn from men to accept some conflict and difference without seeing it as a threat to intimacy, and many men could learn from women to accept interdependence without seeing it as a threat to their freedom. That's a nice pithy summary, which I offer not to deter you from reading this book. There's a slim chance you'll come across it, but judging by this, I think anything by Deborah Tannen would be of the same level of interest. It's pop science, sure, which is great for me. Doesn't go into the technical terminology. You've got footnotes for that if you want. And at the very end there's a nice caveat about telling people how to do things. Experts tell us you're doing things wrong, you've got to change, which always sounds easier than it is. I quote again, sensitivity training judges men by women's standards, trying to get them to talk more like women. Assertiveness training judges women by men's standards and tries to get them to talk more like men. This analysis of the pitfalls and misunderstandings that can occur between men and women in conversation would be a good step to at least being aware of that. And if nothing else, I found the analyses of the conversations enlightening and entertaining. So, can't say better than that.